Chapter 16. Now here's a story to ponder. In April 1860, during the second of his heroic attempts to cross Australia from south to north, John McDouall Stuart reached the almost waterless center of the continent, roughly halfway between the present sites of Darley Waters and Alice Springs. 1,000 miles from anywhere, the spot was the very climax of desolation, as Stuart's fellow explorer Ernest Giles once nicely put it, and Stuart and his men went through hell to get there. They were sick and ragged and half-starved, and it had taken months, but at least they had the satisfaction of knowing that they had become the first outsiders to penetrate to the brutal heart of the continent. So you may imagine Stuart's surprise when, in the middle of this baking nowhere, he and his party encountered 3 Aboriginal men who greeted them by making a secret sign of the Freemasons. Stuart didn't say in his journal what the sign was, but it was clear from his amazed description that it was unlikely to have been coincidental. Then, a few days later, Stuart and his men found horse trackings following a natural course across the plain. Finally, some distance farther on, the explorers were setting up camp for the night when some people from the Warramunga tribe approached. One of Stuart's party, a young man named W.P. Auld, was sitting with his boots off, rubbing his aching feet when one of the Warramunga men knelt before him. While Auld watched bemusedly, the man replaced the boots on Auld's feet and carefully but deftly tied the laces for him, then sat back with a big pleased smile. It was painfully evident to Stuart that he and his men were not, in fact, the first white people to reach the empty center of the country. So who preceded them? No one has ever had the faintest idea. I mention this to make the point that the outback is an odd and unfathomable place. There is something about all that emptiness that exerts a strange hold on people. It is an environment that wants you dead, yet again and again, in the face of the most staggering privations for the meagerest of rewards, explorers ventured into it. Sometimes, as Stuart found, they didn't even bother to leave their names. It is almost not possible to exaggerate the punishing nature of Australia's interior. For 19th century explorers, it wasn't just the inexpressible heat and constant scarcity of water, but 1,000 other miseries. Stinging ants swarmed over them wherever they rested. Natives sometimes attacked with spears. The landscape was full of thorny bushes and merciless spinifex, whose silicate pricks nearly always grew infected from sweat and dirt. Scurvy was a constant plague. Hygiene was impossible. Pack animals grew frequently crushed, crazed, or lost the will to go on. Ernest Giles recorded in his memoirs how his horses once grew so delirious after an unsuccessful search for water that when they returned to camp at the end of the day, the animal plunged its nose into a campfire in the deluded hope that it would provide relief. In pity, Giles gave the injured animal a drink from his own meager supplies, but it died anyway. Even camels could barely cope with the desert conditions. In Beyond Lionheart, A History of Australian Exploration, Glenn McLaren notes how blowflies doted on the wounds of camels, laying eggs in any raw lesions, which soon erupted into horrible swarms of wriggling maggots. On one expedition, a camel's wound grew so infected that the maggots were scooped out daily with a pint pot. Eventually, the animal just lay down and died. When even camels can't manage a desert, you know you've found a tough part of the world. For human and animals alike, nearly every breathing moment was a living hell. And yet, over and over, the explorers returned. Nearly every expedition of the 19th century started off with some ostensible practical purpose: to find a route for a telegraph line, to look for gold, to uncover some zone of hidden promise. But almost without exception, the explorers soon became transfixed by the emptiness. Unable to resist its allure, they just pushed on and on. Perhaps no one suffered privations more willingly and repeatedly to less effect than Ernest Giles. In 1874, while traveling with a companion named Alfred Gibson through the barren wastes of Western Australia, Gibson's horse died. Giles gave Gibson his own mount with instructions to follow their tracks 120 miles back to a place called Fort McKellar to fetch another. Gibson lost his way in the emptiness and was never seen again. The area is now called the Gibson Desert. Left to find his own way back on foot, Giles staggered for days over exhausting sandhills, the last 60 miles with almost no water. It was while in this desperate state, tormented by flies and half dead with hunger, that he famously spotted a baby wallaby and fell onto it, devouring its raw fur, skin and all. These were not exceptional experiences, you understand. This is what awaited you when you went into the outback. When Robert Austin and his men, lost in the featureless wastes of Western Australia, drank their own and their horses' urine, there was nothing terribly unusual about that. Lots of people did likewise in the desert. When Giles found and devoured the baby wallaby, he thought himself exceedingly lucky, not just at that moment, but for years afterward. The delicious taste of that creature I shall never forget, he wrote with sincere and telling enthusiasm in his memoirs. Stuart and his men retained equally fond memories of a time. On the brink of starvation, they found a clutch of dingo puppies and boiled them up in a pot. They were, he wrote, delicious. Why people repeatedly subjected themselves to such ordeals is a mystery that surpasses understanding. Despite the extreme travails he experienced on the fatal expedition with Gibson, Giles returned almost at once to his compulsive wanderings. Stuart did likewise. Almost continuously for 4 years he hurled himself at the unyielding interior until he succeeded in breaking through. Worn out by the effort, he retired to London and died soon after. It is impossible to say who endured the greatest hardships, Stuart or Giles, but there is no question that Giles did it for less reward. No explorer was ever unluckier. In the same year that he lost Gibson in the desert and stumbled 120 miles through appalling heat, Giles also explored the central regions around the area known as Ulala. One day he struggled up a small rise and was confronted with a sight such as he could never have dreamed of finding. Before him, impossibly imposing, stood the most singular monolith on earth, the great red rock now known as Uluru. Hastening to Adelaide to report the find, he was informed that the man named William Christie Gosse had chanced upon it a few days ahead of him and had already named it Ayers Rock in honor of the South Australia governor. Eventually too old to explore, Giles ended up working as a clerk in the gold fields of Coolgardie, where he died in obscurity in 1891. Today he is almost entirely forgotten. No highway bears his name.